Buenos días, buenas
Good
tardes con
morning, good
todos.
afternoon to
Soy
all of you.
Carla Sáenz,
My name
asesora
is
regional de
Carla
bioética.
Sáenz. I am a
Y antes
bioethics
de dar
regional
inicio a este
advisor,
seminario
and
virtual,
before we
quiero dar
initiate
algunas
this virtual
indicaciones para que
webinar, I
todos
would
puedan
like to
seguirnos
share with
siguiendo.
you some
Si
directions for all of you
necesitan
to follow us.
traducción,
If you need
por favor
interpretation,
vayan
please
al signo,
select
el icono de globo
the globe
que dice
icon
interpretación
that
que
reads
está en la parte
interpretation
inferior
at the
derecha
bottom
de su pantalla
right
de
of
Zoom.
your screen on
Si es que
Zoom.
no lo ven,
If you do
vayan al
not see
círculo que
that,
tiene tres
please go
puntitos
to
donde
the
dice más
three
y
dots
ahí pueden
that reads more,
ver
and there you will
los
see
idiomas y
the
escoger español
languages
si quieren
and choose
asegurarse que toda la
Spanish
sesión
if you'd like to make
escuchar
sure
toda la
that
sesión en
you
español.
will be listening to all of the session
So
in
I'm going to say it in
Spanish.
English now. I'm Carla Sáenz. I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm going to start by giving some instructions. So please, if you want to listen to this seminar in English, go to the little globe on the bottom right of your Zoom screen that says interpretation and click on English. That way you'll hear to the entire webinar, will be able to listen to the entire webinar in English. Ahora sí, continuamos la
Now
presentación.
we continue with the
Bienvenidos a una nueva
presentation.
sesión
Welcome
de la
to a
serie de
new
seminarios
session
virtuales
of this
sobre temas
virtual
relacionados con los
series
ensayos
of
clínicos.
seminars
Esta
on
serie fue
clinical
organizada por el
trials.
Programa
This
Regional de
series was
Bioética
organized by
de
the
la Unidad
Regional
de Ciencia y
Bioethics Program
Conocimiento
with
para
the
el
Science
impacto
and
del
Knowledge
Departamento de
Program for
Evidencia e
Impact with the
Inteligencia para la
Evidence and
Atención en Salud
Intelligence Program for
y por la
Action
Unidad
in
de
Health, and
Calidad y
also with
Regulación de Medicamentos
organized
y
by
Tecnologías
Quality and
Sanitarias,
Medicine
que hace
Regulation
parte
for
del Departamento de
Medicines, which is
Innovación,
part of
Acceso a
the
Medicamentos y
Innovation,
Tecnologías
Medicine
Sanitarias
Access
de
or
la
Drug
OMS.
Access, and also
Este
Health
es uno de
Technology with
muchos
PAHO. This is
seminarios de
one
esta
of
serie
many
y los
seminars as part
invitamos
of
a
this
visitar
series,
el
and we
portal de
invite you
ensayos
to
clínicos de
visit
las
the
Américas de
portal
la OPS
that
y
we
el
have
sitio web
within
del Programa
PAHO for
Regional de
clinical
Bioética,
trials in the
donde pueden
Americas, and
ver
also
no
the
solamente
regional
las
workshop
grabaciones de
on
los seminarios previos, sino
site
también
where you will
acceder a
see
muchos de
the
los
previous
recursos que
recordings and also have
vamos
access to many of
a
the
mencionar el
resources
día
that
de
we
hoy.
will be mentioning here
A
today.
manera de organizarnos, les
To
quiero hacer
better
saber
organize
que
ourselves, I would like to
apreciamos mucho si
let
nos
you know
envían
that
sus
we
preguntas, que
really
pueden ser en
like it
español,
when you
en
send us your
inglés o
questions
incluso en
in
portugués,
English, in Spanish, or even in
por medio
Portuguese
de la
by
funcionalidad de
using the
preguntas y respuestas de
Q&A
el Zoom.
button that you see
Si
on the
tuvieran
Zoom
comentarios
screen.
generales
If
o
you have any
material que
general
compartir al
comments or
finalizar,
material to
pueden
share,
enviarlo
any
usando
link,
el chat.
you can send that
Ahora bien,
via
quiero
chat.
resaltar que
Now,
no
I would
se
like
va
to
a dar un
underscore that we are
certificado
not
por su
going to
asistencia en
award a
este
certificate
seminario.
for your
Estamos en posibilidad de emitir
participation in this
certificados para este tipo de
seminar. We are
seminarios
not in a
virtuales.
position
La
to issue
sesión va a ser
certificates
grabada
for this type
y
of
así como
seminars
en
online.
los
We are
seminarios
going to be
previos,
recording
va
this
a ser
session, and as
incluida
previous
en el sitio del
sessions,
Programa
this will
Regional de
be
Bioética, en el
included in
portal de
the
ensayos clínicos de las Américas de
clinical
la OPS
trials
y
for the
además va a ser
Americas
enviada
portal,
por
as
nuestra
well as the
revista de
bioethics portal,
investigación
and we will
ética,
be
donde
also
que también es
sending this
la
through
manera
our
como
listserv, and
anunciaremos
this is the
el
way we will
siguiente
be announcing the
seminario de
next
nuestra
seminar
serie, que será ya en
for
el mes
our
de octubre,
series that
porque
will
este es
be
el
in
segundo que
October,
estamos
because
teniendo
this is
en
the
el mes de
second
agosto.
one we have in August.
El día de hoy
Today,
estamos muy contentos de poder
we are very
presentar
happy to be able
finalmente
to
la publicación
finally
del modelo
present the
regional de
publication of
contrato
the
para ensayos
regional
clínicos
model
y
for
tenemos la
clinical
suerte de
trial
contar
contracts, and
con unas palabras de
we are
bienvenida
fortunate
del
to
doctor
have
Jarbas
our
Barbosa,
director,
director
Jarbas
de la
Barbosa, who
Organización
will be
Panamericana de la Salud.
sharing some
Entonces
welcoming
voy a dar
words
paso al
in a
video del
video that I
doctor
will be
Jarbas
now
Barbosa
showing
antes de
you
continuar.
before we continue.
Distinguished participants, I'm delighted to welcome you to this seminar on a regional template for clinical trials agreements. Research saves lives. The pandemic was a powerful reminder that research impacts directly on our health, our well-being, our economies, and our self-sufficiency. Rigorous clinical trials are indispensable to find cures for diseases and safe and effective health interventions. Countries in the Americas have taken note of that. We have seen them prioritize clinical research in ways we have not seen before. Driven by the regional lessons learned from the pandemic and captured into PAHO's catalyzing research in emergencies guidance and the WHO's resolution to enhance the impact and efficiency of clinical trials, PAHO member states are taking decisive steps to improve their capacity to conduct clinical trials. PAHO is actively supporting them in establishing legal frameworks that ensure clinical trials meet international ethical and regulatory standards and are conducted with transparency and efficiency. We want to avoid waste, ensure oversight is rigorous yet efficient, and maximize impact. Please visit PAHO's portal for clinical trials in the Americas to learn about our regional progress. As part of our initiative to accelerate clinical trials, we have also devised strategies to improve research collaboration, for example, through artificial intelligence. Let me now switch to Spanish. En la OPS tenemos una visión para la región. Nuestra visión es tener ensayos clínicos grandes, multipaís, liderados por investigadores y instituciones de nuestros países y que encuentran soluciones para los problemas de salud de nuestras poblaciones. El modelo de contrato para ensayos clínicos que presentamos hoy es parte del trabajo de OPS para lograr essa visión. En octubre de 2023, tuvimos em Brasília, Brasil, taller regional com os diversos atores involucrados em los ensaios clínicos. Eles ressaltaram que desafio central para ser ensaios multicêntricos é a heterogeneidade de los contratos que especificam as responsabilidades de las partes involucradas em los ensaios. Hacer estes contratos demora mais que obter aprovação ética e regulatória, e há limitada capacidade jurídica em ensaios clínicos. Por isso, hemos desarrollado modelo regional de contrato para ensaios clínicos com as cláusulas essenciais e acorde a los estándares éticos e regulatórios mais atualizados. Agradecemos a todos os expertos da região por seus aportes e seus esforços para implementar este modelo. Estamos seguros de que juntos podemos realizar os processos e lograr a visão da OPS para os ensaios clínicos da região.
Es un gusto haber tenido
It
las
is a
palabras
pleasure
del Dr. Barbosa
to have
para
heard
dar
the
la apertura a la
remarks by
región
Dr.
y
Barbosa
reiterar la
to open this
importancia de
seminar
los
to the
ensayos
region and also
clínicos
to underscore
para
the
la región de
importance
las
of clinical
Américas,
trials in
para
the region
promover la
of the
salud, el
Americas
bienestar,
to
la
promote health,
economía y la
well-being,
autosuficiencia de
the
nuestra
economic
región.
aspect, and also the
Voy a iniciar
self-sufficiency in our region.
con los
I will
antecedentes,
start
contando un
now by
poco más sobre
referring
lo
to
que
the
ya
background and a little bit more
mencionó el doctor
about what Dr. Barbosa
doctor
just mentioned.
Barbosa, para que quienes no hayan tenido oportunidad de
For those
participar
of
en
you who did
conversaciones
not have the
previas sobre el
opportunity to
tema,
participate in
puedan
earlier
comprender
discussions
cómo
on this
surge esta
topic, it is a good
iniciativa del
idea
modelo
to
regional de
understand
contrato
how we
para
started
ensayos
with this
clínicos
initiative, with
que
this
hemos
regional
desarrollado
model,
y que hoy día tenemos
regional
el gran
contract model
gusto de
for
poner a
clinical
disposición de todos
contract for
ustedes.
clinical
Por
trials
el
and that we
momento
are
en
offering
español,
today. Right
aunque
now it is in
está
Spanish,
ya en
but
traducción
we
al
are already
inglés
working
y
into it
portugués. Les
on a
estaremos haciendo
translation
llegar
into
las
English
traducciones
and
pronto.
into Portuguese, and we will
La
be
OPS recibió un
sending
fuerte
these
pedido de la región
translations
para
soon.
atender
We
lo que
had a
constituye un
strong
desafío
request from
regional
the
prominente.
region to
En el taller
address
que
a
mencionó el doctor
challenge
Barbosa
and a
en
significant
Brasilia,
challenge in the
en
region.
que
Dr. Barbosa referred to
congregamos
a
a
workshop
distintos
in
expertos de
Brasilia.
toda la
We
región y de todas las
had
perspectivas,
several experts
investigadores,
from the region and
reguladores, instituciones
from
de
research
investigación,
and the participation of
todas las
researchers, regulators,
instituciones
and
nacionales,
also
autoridades
national
nacionales en
institutions,
general.
national authorities in general.
Vimos que
And we saw that
contratos para
the
ensayos
contracts
clínicos
for
representan un
clinical
obstáculo, que
trials
toma más
are an
tiempo
obstacle
para
that
iniciar
take
un gran ensayo que,
that lengthen the
que la
time it takes
autorización
to
regulatoria y que la
initiate a
aprobación.
clinical trial. It takes
Nosotros
longer
estamos
than the ethical
motivados, como decía
approval
el
and the
doctor
regulatory
Barbosa, con la
approval.
visión de poder
We
tener
are
un gran
motivated,
ensayo
as
clínico
Dr.
regional
Barbosa
liderado
mentioned, to
desde
have
nuestra región.
a clinical trial led by the region, and we know of its importance in general and significantly also for the health agencies. So to implement this vision, we need to streamline our capacity to have fast clinical trials. This proposal for a regional contract model is intended to guarantee clinical trials in an efficient manner without losing the ethical and regulatory standards. Quite the contrary, we'd like to make sure that the ethical and regulatory standards are followed in their most updated version. The ethics, the rigor, and efficiency should work hand in hand. From the region, we had already shared this view, starting with the pandemic, because one of the lessons learned that you can see in our publication that is catalyzing ethical research in emergencies is that we need to work with the various challenges that we have from the ethical and regulatory point of view. The result of this publication that we are presenting today is a genuine regional effort. It was a request by our region, but the development process for this publication has been greatly improved with the ongoing work of experts throughout the region. You must recall that when we started to work on this, we analyzed the regulations in the various countries of the region in connection with the contract governing clinical trials. We established later on an expert group in the region after mapping all of the resources and trying to include as many countries as possible and including as many points of view as possible, but also guaranteeing the management of the legal aspects that are key to a contract, because this is a legal instrument. In addition to the large group of experts who were very kind to work with us throughout the process, we had a core team with Sara Carracero, Adrian Royal, and Ms. Burger, who will be speaking to you later. And we worked together on a proposal that was greatly reviewed by the experts. And you would recall that we also presented this draft of the regional model as part of a virtual seminar that we had before, because we were convinced that you had a lot to contribute to fine-tune the details, and we also presented this for public consultation. And some of the experts said, well, this can be reviewed and some aspects can be improved. And after all of the reviews and talking to the teams that oversee the research at the regional level, we have a model that we hope will be useful to you. We will be sharing this information with you to have access to the new model after we explain the key aspects, but we invite you again to visit the webpage for the Regional Bioethics Program, where you can have access to this resource and other resources. So now I will stop sharing the screen, and I would like to invite my colleague Sara Carracedo with the Regional Bioethics Program with PAHO to present the core content of this publication. Sara? I think that legal expertise is key. Sara Carracedo is an attorney by training, and Sara, please go ahead. I thank you, Carla, for the presentation. It is a pleasure to be here in this final session on the regional contract model for clinical trials, and also for its final presentation. And I would like to start by sharing with you some general aspects that we have shared with you in previous sessions. What are these contracts? These are legally binding agreements that will provide for the obligations, responsibilities, liability of the parties that are involved in the development of a clinical trial. But these contracts also include the administrative and economic aspects in connection with the trial. It is also important to bear in mind that those contracts are not just a mere obligation that need to be signed, but this is the document that will provide for the legal obligations to protect the interests of the parties, of the participants, and also to clearly define the financial aspects and also to promote trust and transparency among the various parties involved. As we know, the best clinical practices, that is the regulatory standard for the authorities that are requesting an authorization from the national authorities, establish that contracts are needed that also need to govern the financial aspects, the roles, and also the responsibilities. In addition to this, these contracts need to consider key aspects, such as the responsibility vis-a-vis potential damages to the participants. But not only best practices include these agreements, but many of the regulations within the region, since they follow clinical practices, also call for this signed contract before going into a clinical trial, and also for an insurance policy to cover any damages given adverse events in connection with this trial, the procedures, or the participation in general. But neither best clinical practices nor national standards determine the specific clauses that need to be included in the agreements, and there are no clear guidelines as to the content of these agreements. Because of this, their drafting, negotiation, and signing are part of complex and burdensome processes for research facilities that are starting with this, or for researchers who are working on clinical trials for the first time or in the early stages. When we presented this regional proposal for the model, the key regulatory framework that we took into account includes the international ethical guidelines for research related to the health of with human beings. That is the current standard that is in force and the most comprehensive one, as well as the good clinical practices. So this model follows these standards, and it also bears in mind that there will also be an application that has to do with the jurisdiction where this contract will be signed, and also that these provisions will have to be part of this contract based on the legal requirements to be applied, and also in a complementary fashion, the foreign law may apply if this is agreed by the parties. This proposal for a contract model provides for the minimum key guidelines. This is the very basis that needs to be included in these documents, and it also aligns the key content of these key provisions. And for example, when we think of insurance policies, this is an important topic, and it is also part of this contract. There are also provisions on this topic. The objective is to guide institutions, sponsors, and researchers in the contract negotiation, and to streamline the start of the trials, which, as we heard from Carla at the beginning, usually the contract becomes the obstacle and it takes longer than a regulatory approval or an ethical approval. We are talking about a tripartite contract. This is what we mentioned in the last session. We have the sponsor, the research institution, and the main researcher as the stakeholders. But it is possible, for example, for an organization to participate because the sponsor may give away part of their responsibility to participate. So this does not mean that there could be no reference, it could not be used as reference, or some of the clauses or all of them or some of them are useful for other sorts of cooperation within the clinical trial. This proposal has two key aspects. The first one is the role of the institutions, and the second one is the inclusion of the main researcher. And this is the focus here is on strengthening the institutional leadership in the development of the clinical trials. The idea is for the institutions not to be mere providers of resources and a structure, rather they need to actually provide for the technical support from the outset so that there is participation from the very beginning in the negotiation, so that we can work towards the professionalization of the clinical trials in the region and also promote research at the institutional level. And as I mentioned before, the inclusion of the researcher is a key aspect. It is an agreement that requires the presence of the researcher, because in this way, the terms of the contract are known, and also there is an obligation to comply with the terms. And also this implies that the researcher becomes the leader that is responsible for the clinical trial. And this also implies and reinforces the role of the researcher as the guarantor of participation. So the scope of this model, as I mentioned before, entails a minimum number of clauses, and the idea is to guarantee a legally valid relationship, and also it has to be a balanced contract that is transparent among the parties with a clear allocation of responsibilities so that all of the parties know what they are being asked to do, what their obligations are for the proper development of the clinical trial. Carla also mentioned that in the final portion of this initial consultation, we had a public consultation that was published on PAHO's website. We had also expert review, as well as the review of this document by Francais. And after the last review that we had, we received various comments, and I would like to sum up those comments that were repeated, that we have taken into account, and that clearly make the contract a stronger document and a more valuable document for the region. To begin with, the contract is not just a simple model or table, but it has an introduction now where we see a description of the background that Carla mentioned at the beginning, context, and why we're doing this and why it is so important for the region. There is also specifications as to the scope of the model, as I mentioned before, even though there are 3 parties to the contract, and it has to do with more frequent clinical trials in the region. It can also be applied to other sorts of cooperation. And there is also a section that explains how to use the model. The model can be easily downloaded in the Word format so that the interested parties and the users can use the clauses and also adapt what needs to be adapted. And this takes me to say that many of the comments that we received, they were all very important, had to do with specific requirements that they have in their own legal system. And this model is not intended to reproduce legal or domestic legislation, and the idea is not to reproduce what we already have in the good clinical practices. So even though these are all important issues and they are all part of the package that we need to observe when analyzing a clinical trial, this contract model is not intended to copy these provisions, and for that reason, many of the requirements at the local level have not been included because this is a general model for the various countries, the various actors with different institutional or regulatory requirements.
So this model is rather adaptable if you require, for example, anti-corruption clauses. These can then be added into the body of the contract, and the fact that they are not present does not mean that they're not necessary or that they were overlooked, but rather we're looking to reproduce other types of regulations, and the model is flexible for adaptation purposes depending on the context. Two additional important points that I wanted to mention include that we've added two new clauses that in the beginning had not been included. The first of which relates to authorization for the use of names, logos, symbols, brands, or distinctive signs from any of the parties. As I recall, based on the comments we've received, this is a basic clause that is included in most contracts, and we include this obligation of having a prior session and something in writing agreed by all the parties before using the name, logo, symbol, brand, or any of the parties, be it for educational purposes, for publication purposes, anything related to the clinical trial. So this new clause was incorporated into this final version of the model contract. Another clause that was incorporated addresses access to interventions that end up being beneficial. This was very helpful because it was suggested by many of the experts when we conducted the public consultation. What we've achieved is a general clause that responds to the requirements of the regulatory demands that may or may not exist in the various countries. So what we mentioned, the sponsor, in coordination with the principal researcher, must provide continuous access to any interventions that have proven to be beneficial, and based on any relevance, any persons that have concluded their participation in the clinical trial after the trial is concluded. Additionally, it specifies that the period or the conditions for this access to the interventions will be based on certain standards and applicable regulatory standards. I've already mentioned that it's important for us to read this clause very carefully based on the other provisions, because we have a vast diversity of trials, we have different research interventions and potential results. So putting this ethical obligation in practice needs to be analyzed in great deal based on the international standards framework. So these are the main far-reaching changes that we made. We've made some small changes as well relating to the use of language as well as other more complicated, more challenging issues such as access to interventions that prove to be beneficial. In all of these efforts, we've had a great deal of positive feedback, and we've been studying these very carefully to make sure that we include all of the suggested ideas. Now the information is readily available, and now the next step would be to, of course, try to achieve its implementation. And what we expect from the implementation of this model contract is that we will be promoting greater certainty in the legal framework related to clinical trials at the regional level. This would improve and streamline the model contract process for these types of multi-stakeholder clinical trials. This will be very beneficial for the region, and this, of course, will be closely aligned with the highest and most rigorous current international standards that we have in place. Now you can see here the QR code that will take you to the proposed regional model contract. We want to thank all of the experts and stakeholders that contributed to our efforts, who provided very valuable insights. We've been learning a great deal throughout this process. It was a real pleasure to be able to get to this point with all of your support. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sara. This has been a wonderful learning process for us. And I wanted to highlight the contribution made by the Legal Advisor's Office at PAHO, specifically Pamela Zúñiga, throughout the course of the entire process, because it has been a very valuable process. And as we stated previously, we don't really have a great deal of expertise in the region with all the attorneys that are experts in anything related to clinical trials. So now I'd like to begin our panel. We have excellent guest panelists. Many of them were very involved in the development of this proposed model contract. As Sara was saying, this is a sort of aid, and you'll see in the publication where we explain that this can be modified in this way, or this may need certain adjustments depending on the national standard framework. The idea is for it to be a functional document that can be helpful to any country in the region. And before I introduce our first panelist, I'd like to insist again, as I stated previously, whenever we share a draft, something that we are still working on, we always insist that this be a fair and equitable proposal for the researcher, for the institution, for the sponsor, and we're very happy to be able to present this today. Of course, it's only in its Spanish version today, but we hope that no later than 2 weeks from now, we will have versions available in English and subsequently in Portuguese as well. So now I'd like to introduce Adriel Reutemann, who is an attorney, legal advisor for the General Office of Research for the Ministry of Health in the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. He's a member of several ethics committees, including the Central Ethics or Ethical Research Committee at the Ministry of Health in that country, and he's part of the nucleus that helped us develop this model contract. Go ahead, Adriel. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you very much, Carla, for the introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. I need to say that it's a real pleasure and has been a real pleasure to participate in this process. And any positive news that I may be able to mention today comes with a certain disclaimer. I've been very involved in developing the content for this model contract. Nevertheless, I would have loved to have had a model contract like this when I was first starting out as an attorney. Generally speaking, people believe that attorneys that work in the health arena, by and large, can work directly on anything ranging from health ministry issues to clinical trials. But there are great differences between one concept and the other. And the truth is that until now, we didn't have a model document such as this that was properly grounded with a great deal of validation. Now, you can go out and research information or research existing literature or existing models on the internet. But many times we don't find what we need. And so this review process at the international level, as Sara and our other colleagues mentioned, this is a tremendous undertaking. And it mostly has to do with, just like there are attorneys that are taking their first steps, there are also many institutions and principal researchers who don't have the slightest idea how to begin this process. They can be very well versed on the discipline that they're going to be researching, but when they try to set up a contract to be able to carry out a project with the Ministry of Health, then they run into a variety of issues, like how they're going to handle managing the publication of the results, who's going to own the intellectual property. We needed to address insurance issues. We need to determine who will be the designated responsible party. There's a myriad of requirements that if you don't address at the beginning, many times aren't even considered over the long term. So this is something that was primarily very modular. You'll look at the publication later on. It's all broken down into various sections, and it's more of a trigger so that at the beginning, at the outset, the various participating parties will know what the minimum basic requirements for this form of document are, and they need to consider the institutional context as well as the research and legal context as well. But this is just a starting point that provides a great deal of value, and this allows us to not have to reinvent the wheel every time we undertake this. So once we have this model, we start to address some of the different clauses and provisions that were proposed in the Brasilia workshop. So as a regional model contract, it addresses regulatory issues, it addresses the collaboration systems, the trusted system, the reliability issues. And so it necessarily strengthens the region and enables it to be able to carry out block research projects. This plants the seed for an idea within the region to undertake multicentric research projects and not have to rely on other mechanisms. So I believe that this proposed contract addresses many challenges involved in the implementation and adaptation of these instruments. But typically, the greatest challenge has to be overcoming the regulatory ethical challenges for the institutions. But once you overcome these differences and once you have a proper level of adaptability, this is an instrument that could possibly aid in improving the reporting processes. In many projects that we had in our city, we had minimum requirements, information requirements for anything we did, and we did come up with the standard framework, but this led to the formalizing of our reporting mechanism through various established fields and various established stakeholders. So this opens up a very large subset of opportunities and possibilities. Now, this may seem like a starting point, and the experience and the background that anybody that works on this document will certainly have a great deal of importance. And at this time, there are many projects that this could be used for in a very effective way. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, nor do I want to cover too many areas because we have other panelists that will speak after me. But if we think about how we can address the implementation, then we would be talking about a cascaded adoption process with the usual organizations, PAHO, WHO, and the states. And this will be very educational to ensure that all of the institutions, the sponsors, the CROs, the researchers can adopt this model. At the very least, some of the basic content, and they can all try to ascertain what elements are most useful for their purposes. Now, we may have some CROs that have their own clauses and provisions. They have their own legal advisors and requirements. But once we have a more open pathway, then this allows for much better legal certainty. It accelerates the process and it minimizes the cost. So I think it's a very valuable tool for all of the stakeholders that are involved. As we said in Brasilia, training is key. It's important for us to train groups of experts in issues related to regulatory issues and ethical issues, as well as clinical trials. And we discussed during those sessions that it's very important for us to distinguish attorneys that work for the research committee versus the attorney that works on drafting a contract. Many times, due to a lack of resources, the attorney that specializes in one thing ends up being recruited to work on the other issues as well. But we need to understand or gather or garner a better understanding of the roles for the attorneys and all of this. They need to understand the methodologies, the research ramifications, the various requirements for the discipline. But the institutional attorney, the role of the principal researcher, both seek to protect the interests of the stakeholders that are participating. So if we have certain points in the contract already standardized, we won't have to then think about standardizing everything based on the organizational structure or the project structure. And this will make the management, the execution, and the implementation of these contracts much more efficient and streamlined. Generally speaking, most organizations don't have their areas of specialty that well developed. And even some organizations may have a research office with personnel that can address the negotiation and the legal frameworks. This tool could be very useful for those people in those offices to help them in their legal negotiations. Beyond that, what's important here is that all of the spaces addressed in the contract need to be addressed in a collaborative way, in a flexible way, and more importantly, in a non-sequential way. One of the things that really bogs down the process is to wait for a benchmark or something to be fulfilled before we can move on to the next topic. And many times this doesn't make any sense. And many times the delays we see in the bureaucracy are due to this sequential approach. So if we can streamline the process and do things simultaneously working towards a unified goal, this, by and large, will help us overcome a lot of the barriers to efficiency. Just to conclude, I think that this model contract that we are presenting today is not a finished product. It's really just the beginning for many other possible things. In fact, I expect that this will be carefully reviewed. It will lead to many different experiences, many adaptations that are necessary for the region, and in the end will become a cutting-edge instrument that will open the opportunity for the entire region to engage in a number of changes that are very beneficial. Thank you very much. Thank you, Adriel. I think that, in fact, this is a step that if you had asked me 2 years ago if we're going to work on this, I don't think I would have ever even thought of it. But we did try to ensure that our technical cooperation could respond to the extent possible to the needs and the requests and demands of the region. This is a good first step to try to address a very urgent need to be able to overcome certain challenges that are in place at the present time. But as we move forward, as we put this instrument in practice, or as we use this instrument in the real world, we can then come to understand what other actions we can undertake to serve our region in a much better way. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Fernando Francisco, Executive Manager of ABRACO, which is the Brazilian organization or the Brazilian Association of Clinical Organizations in Brazil. He was one of the participants in the Brasilia workshop where we received this request in response to all of the discussions. And it's a real pleasure to have him today with us today. Fernando, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Sí, hola Carla.
Very well. I am here on behalf of ABRACRO. This is the Brazilian Association of CROs. I represent ABRACRO. I'm the executive director of this organization. And we focus on discussing the main issues related to clinical trials in Brazil, especially the most impactful issues for the day-to-day operations and research. ABRACRO represents 36 foreign and Brazilian companies. This month, in fact, we will be celebrating more than 25 years of existence. This is an important benchmark for us, a milestone. And one of the objectives for the association is to guarantee ethical practices with regard to the rights of volunteers that take part in clinical trials. All of this in compliance with the regulatory standards, not just the Brazilian ones, but also international standards as well. I wanted to say that one of the most important aspects of ABRACRO are our technical staff. We have more than 400 volunteers from various countries that provide support in this regard. And we have a specific committee that addresses clinical trial contract issues. Our committee, next slide, please. Next slide, these are the members.
Sí. Ok, gracias. Ok. Volver
okay, go back one, please. Go back one slide. We have several technical committees
investigación clínica es uno de los más
where
importantes
they
porque
address clinical trials contracts, which
trata
are
de um
extremely
tema
important
muito
because it
sensível para,
addresses a
não somente
very
para
sensitive
os
issue, not
CROs,
just
pero para os patrocinadores e para
for
os centros de
the
investigação.
sponsors and the
E,
researchers,
claro,
but for the
para
participants.
dos investigadores. Ok? Um, nosotros, en este comité,
Now, as part of the
he
committee,
realizado talleres con CROs e centros
we've
de
conducted
investigação para
a
debater las
number of
melhores
workshops with
práticas
other
na
research centers
negociação e
to
execução de
improve
contratos.
and
Estas atividades, estes workshops,
exercise
foram
best
muito
practices.
importantes
In
para
many of these
entender,
workshops, it was
para que
important for
as
us to
partes
understand
pudessem entender o que passa com a outra
all of the
parte,
issues faced by the parties so
mientras
they could
negociam
understand each other and
e para tentar
learn from each other.
tornar o processo de negociação de los
And
contratos
in a
mais
certain
célere
way,
e
we were
mais
able
eficaz, mais
to
eficiente.
address a negotiation
Ok?
process
Bueno,
that proved to be more
considerando o
streamlined and more
cenário da
effective.
investigação clínica hoje, temos que
Now,
considerar
when we
que
look at the clinical
as
research scenario today,
tecnologias médicas são mais
we see that
complexas.
medical technology
Tem,
is more and more
e
complex,
os estudos
and
clínicos
the
também
clinical
são mais
studies
complexos,
are
com
also
desenhos mais
more and more
complexos.
complex.
Então, é mais difícil que o
And they
contrato
include a much more complex
trate de la
design. So it's
parte
harder
não
for
solamente legal, pero la parte
the
financeira,
researchers
de
to
aspectos
address the
financeiros, de uma
legal as
forma
well as financial aspects
mas
of the
não
project.
pode ser de uma forma simples. Tem
And
que
you
ser
can't
de uma
do
forma
this, nor
também
can you
mais
address it in a
complexa.
simple way.
Então,
It
isto
also
toma mais
invariably
tempo de todas
entails
as
a more
partes.
complex process, and it needs
E aqueles
to
países em que
heed the
temos
interests of all of the
análise de estudos
participating
mais
stakeholders.
rápidos por as
Now we see
autoridades, os
some
prazos de
more
análise são mais curtos para
analyses
os contratos.
carried out by
Este pode ser
authorities, and
problema
many times
em
the
muitas
analysis
ocasiões, em
can
muitos
delay the
casos.
contract, and in
Entendeu?
many
E os
cases,
contratos requerem
it
mais
serves to
atenção
bog
e
down the process.
dedicação.
Some
Pode
contracts
ser
require more attention
personal,
and dedication.
dedicado, que podem
And by
convertir
this, I
em
mean that
cuello de
we
botella.
require dedicated staff
É uma
within the team to address
critical
these
task, é uma
issues.
tarefa crítica em todo o
So
processo
this can
de um ensaio
become a
clínico.
bottleneck, and they have the
Então,
critical
isso
task
ponto
of
de
addressing these
atenção.
issues in the
Por
clinical trial
isto,
process. That's why
quando falamos em
when
modelo
we talk
regional
about
de
a
contrato,
regional
é
model
algo
contract,
muito bueno, é muito importante que tenhamos
it's
aí
very
modelo para
positive
toda a
and very
região.
important for us to have a
Próximo
model
slide.
contract for the entire region. Next slide, please.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Entonces,
Then
tentamos entender
we
los
can try
pesos
to understand
de los stakeholders neste processo.
the different
Podemos
steps in
entender
this
que
process, and
quando
we
um
can
sponsor,
see that
o sponsor
for
tem
sponsor,
template de contrato,
the sponsor has a contract
por exemplo, de
template, for
estúdio,
example,
ele
for
vai
study.
enviar
And as a matter of
do
fact,
template para
the
todos os
template will be
diferentes
sent
sites,
to the
os
various
centros
sites,
de investigação,
to the various
ok?
research
Pero
centers. But
centro
one center
recebe diferentes templates
receives
de
different
diferentes estúdios, de
templates
diferentes
for different
sponsors.
studies and
Então,
sponsors.
para os centros de
Therefore,
pesquisa, de investigação,
for the
é muito mais trabalhoso, é
research
muito mais
centers, it
delicado
is much more
considerar e
burdensome to
trabalhar e
consider
negociar todos os
and
diferentes
work
contratos.
with
Pero, mais
the
uma vez,
same
por isso é muito
contract, but
importante modelo,
it is very
modelo
important
único,
to
modelo
have
unificado
one
para
single model,
contratos na
a
região.
unified
Por quê?
model
Porque irá
for the
ajudar
contracts in the region,
muito
because it will be
centros, principalmente.
very useful for the centers.
Outro ponto importante é
Another
que os
important
centros. Pode passar,
aspect
por favor?
is that
Próxima diapositiva. Outro ponto importante que quero dizer é que
another important
os
aspect I would
centros
like to
de
mention is
investigação
that the
são
research centers
normalmente mais frágeis
are
de,
the most fragile link within the chain of clinical research, because from the financial legal point of view, I believe that the contract model will be highly important, in particular for research centers. But the sponsors and the various organizations need to understand this way of working, and oftentimes they need to understand that by using the center model that is based on a regional model will be highly positive for all of the study processes and the technology to bring it back to the market. As I mentioned before, the centers need special support, and in the contract, it is very important to have well-established principles, not only for the protocols, but this will also be important for the practitioners involved in the studies, in the trials, and also the data security. We are now talking about insurance here in Brazil for data security within the framework of research, and this is something highly important to us.
Bien, y para concluir,
to conclude, I would like to congratulate PAHO, Carla, Sara, and all of the persons who participated in developing this model, which, as I have mentioned, is highly important for the region. And please count on us to communicate the model to the sponsors, to the centers, and to all of the stakeholders here in Brazil that are working on clinical trials. As I mentioned before, having one single model for the region will be something highly advantageous for all of us who work on clinical trials. Carla, we will wait until we get the Portuguese version, if that's okay with you.
Okay, so gracias a todos.
I would like to thank you all. And I am here available to answer any questions you may have. And again, I give back the floor to you. Thank you very much, Fernando. We thank you for your remarks. We agree that the research institutions tend to be the weakest link within this structure, and this allows me to mention a current initiative that WHO is implementing with our support, and it is a tool to determine the maturity of the institutions carrying out clinical research, with the goal not to give them a bad grade, rather to help them cooperate, and also to determine the actions to be implemented by a research institution to strengthen their work and also to conduct more and better clinical trials. Now it is a pleasure to welcome Francisca Rodriguez. Francisca Rodriguez is Innovation and Health Manager with the Pharmaceutical Innovation Chamber in Chile. She's currently participating in this session as FIPHARMA representative, that is the Latin American Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industry, that is working with PAHO in various areas through PARF and also through a formal relationship with the organization. Francisca, please go ahead, and it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. I thank you, Carla, for the presentation, and I also thank PAHO for the opportunity to be here with you today to discuss such a relevant topic for the region, that is how to promote clinical trials to have better and a higher number of clinical trials. I would like to start by telling you how, from the pharmaceutical industry point of view, this tool is very important. First, it allows us, just a second, I see a message on the screen. First, it allows Latin America to increase their representation in connection with global clinical trials. Right now, we account for 5% of the clinical trials that are carried out in Latin America, but we have more than 8% of the world population, and also high diversity, professional talent, capacity, and also hospital infrastructure. However, oftentimes we are left behind from the region point of view because of topics such as this one, the ability to have similar times to start the clinical trials. And this is something key at the time of selecting the centers and countries that will be conducting research. So if we would like to increase our participation as a region, we need to be able to have clear rules and also faster processes and more predictable processes in contract. Various studies show us, and you also mentioned this, Sarah and Carla already mentioned this, that the process to negotiate and sign a contract may account for a great deal of the total time necessary to initiate a trial in Latin America. And in some countries of the region, the signing of the contract and all of the negotiation surrounding the contract may take even more than 9 months. And if we look at this compared to other countries that are currently leading clinical research, we are behind. For example, if we look at Spanish indicators, Spain has everything clearly identified, and we can see that the time it takes to sign a contract from the moment the protocol is completed and ready until the signing of the contract is about 120 days. That is more than 4 months. This makes us less competitive vis-a-vis other regions to activate some centers that in other cases are activated over weeks. So that's the reason why this regional model is so important, because it allows us to have better times and also to speed up the processes and also to comply with this as a standard for the region. At the same time, we see that other countries are moving forward with initiatives and strategies to promote the development of other clinical trials. In Europe, there are several projects that are centralizing processes, and for example, they have centralized approval of the regulatory standards. Spain right now is working through its autonomous entities with a single contract model. So if we move towards these shared standards, we can also get a higher number of clinical trials in the region, and also by implementing this type of work, not only with a unified or a single contract, but all of the initiatives that you just mentioned from the point of view of PAHO, increase trust and governance among the sponsors, the health authorities, the research centers, researchers, and also the patients who participate in the clinical trials. And if we think of implementation, I believe that the contract model that you have developed is quite complete and self-explanatory. So I congratulate you for that work. And I believe that before we think of implementation, it might be quite beneficial to focus on thinking of the key objective for a tool such as this one. Therefore, we should focus the model not only on offering this contract model, but also to attain improvement in efficiency, management, and also the performance metrics behind the clinical trials. Therefore, one of the items that we can promote is the measuring of the times, the deadlines that we have in the region for the initiation, the start of a clinical trial, but also the number of clinical trials that are being approved yearly, and also in the main centers, countries, the number of ethics committees, the time it takes to have the regulatory approval, the time it takes to contract, and also the time to start working with the first patient. We also need to have clear goals to see the impact of strategies such as this one, not only this strategy, but also all of the strategies that you are currently implementing. We should also focus on an increase in the number of clinical trials or the representation that Latin America has in the total number of clinical trials worldwide. Then, together with this contract model, we need to include a management model. And this is what we heard before too. Given the experience that Argentina has had in Buenos Aires with a contract model, this also takes us to a conversation beyond the dialogue to see how we can increase the efficiency of the process with the management model that includes an improvement of the good practices in the region. So we need to document the best processes to optimize implementation, but we also need to train the teams that are managing clinical trials in the various institutions so that we can align ourselves with the international deadlines. Once we start using this contract model, I think it is necessary not only to move towards the dialogue with the health ministries, the regulatory entities, and the research centers, but we also need to talk to the pharmaceutical industry because at the end of the day, they are the ones who will be adopting these contract models and also facilitate their use. And then you can count on FIFARMA, and FIFARMA not only represents the innovation companies that are currently present in Latin America, but also their local associations. As Carla mentioned, I represent not only FIFARMA, but also the Pharmaceutical Innovation Chamber from Chile. And we are convinced that we need to work together on this project because the local associations can help us promote the knowledge and exchange of information about a tool such as this one. We have also seen that in general, it is quite clear what the roles are. The justification for participation in this process to start and approve a clinical trial in connection with regulatory guidelines and also ethics committees and also the pharmaceutical sector. But we do see a weakness, and this is what we heard in previous webinars when this topic was discussed, meaning that there is no clear point of reference for the research centers in the public sector. So that's where we have one of the challenges, and one of the challenges is to implement this model is to promote a clear institutional concept, not only within the research centers, but also within the health network in general. The research centers from the public sector need to have specialized technical units so that the contract model can be validated and used as a model. I referred before to the need to train the administrative and technical teams within the hospitals on the use of this contract, and also to optimize the internal negotiation and signing processes, and also to reduce the number of points of contact within the research centers. We need to have a clear identification of who is in charge of the process, and also we need to make progress towards the digital use of the various steps and also the use of electronic signatures. This is also something that was mentioned in other webinars, but one of the strategies used to diminish the time it takes to sign a contract and start a clinical trial within the research sites is the use of a framework agreement that is later adjusted with specific annexes based on the protocol to reduce negotiation times. In addition to this, we also need to promote parallel processes within the countries. So the negotiation of the contract may start at the same time that the regulatory approval is requested, as well as the approval from the ethics committees. And I see that this tool has the ability not only to spread the importance of this type of model, but also to improve the management within the process. We also need to promote clear institutionality within the centers, and also greater cooperation from the local pharmaceutical associations to communicate and also refer to the various tools of this type that we can use. So if we would like to be actors in this sector and move to a higher degree of participation in Latin America in these clinical trials, it is important to work together. And we need to standardize the contracts, which is not an end in itself, but it is also a tool to increase the participation, shorten the times, and also increase equity in the participation in clinical trials. This is something that we see when some hospitals in the area are not participating, but they would be able to do so in the future. And at the end of the day, I think that our goal should be clear in connection with these items. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer any questions that may come up later on. I thank you, Francisca. I thank you for insisting on two topics that are key, in my opinion. On the one hand, this is a piece of a very complex scaffolding, and the idea is not to have just a single building block be the solution to everything, but we need to work on every single building block of this scaffolding that will give us a regional system, not only national, for research with the ability to conduct more and better clinical trials led by the region to address our health needs. And that will be key to reduce the inequality in health that we have globally. Secondly, on the other hand, efficiency and also the importance for us to see, or for us to have a clear guiding path to see the indicators that would allow us to determine how much better the work in the region can be, the progress we can have as compared to other countries in the regions or other countries in different regions. You made several remarks that go hand in hand with the initiative to measure the maturity of the clinical trial institutions, and they're also the core of our regional initiative, of our accelerator for clinical trials, as we like to call it. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Carlos Alvarez, who is a doctor and a researcher, and we thought it was key to have the point of view of a researcher who has been the main researcher in many clinical trials on vaccines and antimicrobials. So he does have experience working with various actors in various countries, and it will be a pleasure to listen to what he has to say in connection with how to use this tool, how to implement it to carry out more and better clinical trials in the region. Carlos, you have the floor. Greetings. Thank you, Carla, for the invitation to participate in this forum, and I hope I can speak slower than my colleague from Chile. You mentioned the first meeting that we held in Brazil 2 or 3 years ago, and now how pleasant it is to be in this panel today. All in all, as a researcher in Latin America, we oftentimes see that it goes beyond science and ethics in a clinical trial. It goes to the contract, and given a trial, for example, that has been already approved from the regulatory point of view, and it also has the approval of the ethics committee, we have to wait for months to clarify a clause that we have with the sponsor and through the regulatory commission. So I think that this regional model helps us overcome that bottleneck. I think that the initiative clearly is important because it will reduce the heterogeneity that we may have in some of the contracts. And oftentimes, as we heard from our colleagues, the delay may imply that we do not have the legal expertise in a specific area, and this results in stagnation in the decision-making process for some hospitals or small or large clinics that focus on healthcare rather than the ability to participate in a clinical trial. But these are institutions that at the same time do have the researchers who are the individuals who may benefit from the development of these clinical trials. Oftentimes, the clinical trials allow individuals to have access to technology or other options when they have exhausted everything at their disposal. So I think that this work will increase equality in the region, will increase quality and the quality of research in different countries in the region, and this will increase equality. So some hospitals do have the expertise and already have models that account for a great deal of experience, but as I said before, hospitals will have the same resources and they will be able to work at the same level as other hospitals, which is the accelerator that we have in the region. I believe that one of the important concepts that we heard had to do with clear insurance policies. This allows us to have some clarity surrounding one of the topics that may lead to a great degree to significant discomfort. So I think that this is a way to protect the participants in trials and also the institutions and it does so on an equal footing. So I believe that the transparency in the relationship among the sponsor and the researchers for publication is clear, and I think it is important here to insist on sponsors. Even though we are already doing this, it is a good idea to also publish negative results. We are biased to only publish positive results, positive findings, but oftentimes we see that negative results are not so clearly published. And I think that as part of the communication between the researcher and the sponsor, we also need to make it clear that transparency, clinical scientific transparency will be preserved. The communication will be preserved, but the findings need to be published to continue with our credibility. And I believe also that the teams usually within public universities lack some specialized instruments. And this tool, in my opinion, as we have heard, will help strengthen these centers. And it will also contribute to having a balance in the negotiations among the sponsors, the researchers, and the institution itself. So how can we move on to the next step? I believe that this initiative is the first step. It is a very strong step, and it has a very important advantage. This is coming from PAHO, from WHO, as an official document. This document has to be adapted to the needs of the individual countries, but this has to be a basic standard that allows for the various countries in the region to have it as an important document, and also the provisions need to be included in the provisions by the ethical committees. That is to say, the inclusion of these regulations. Then clearly the institutions will adapt the model to their own context, to their legal capacity, as we heard before, and those who need it the most will realize that this is a great guidance document. I think that this will also allow for researchers to focus more on what we have to focus, and that is to focus on the situation of the study, the technical aspect of the study, and also to focus on having the patients feel safe and to reduce any negative instances. I think it is also clear that and important that we need to move forward with indicators to see whether this tool is working or not. And I think that a key indicator could be, for example, timing, and how is it that we can determine significant progress and avoid delays in the negotiation process. Finally, I believe that the contract model goes beyond being a legal instrument. It is a tool that accounts for the trust for the patient, the researcher, the sponsor. The sponsor will have a clear idea as to how it will be to work here in Latin America. This will also instill trust among the regulators. Even though most of us speak the same language, it doesn't look that way. And finally, it requires political commitment to strengthen technical capacity and training for the medical staff within the various institutions.
Above all else, they need to be able to have contract expertise with people that trust us, and that's an integral part of the discussion. And just to conclude, clearly, as we heard from Sarah earlier, there's a model in which there's an external sponsor, but we also need to consider that sometimes the sponsor may be a public institution, a university in the region, and this works a little bit differently. And we could discuss this further along. but they also may have a different legal model than what we're considering for a sponsor in our pharmaceutical projects.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you very much,
Álvarez.
Carlos Alvarez.
Me alegra mucho que hayas traído el
I'm
tema de la
happy that you brought
confianza,
up
que
the
es un
issue
desafío
of
clave para la
confidence and
investigación en
trust, which
nuestra
is a
región.
challenge for research in our region.
Ciertamente las demoras de las que
And
mencionas
indeed,
muchas
some of the
veces están
delays that
causadas
you
por
referred to
la
are
falta
many
de
times
pericia.
caused
Uno se demora por esta
due to a
parálisis que
lack of
mencionabas cuando
expertise.
no
The
tiene el
delays
conocimiento necesario.
are
Y ojalá esta
a
herramienta
result of a
facilite
paralysis
las
that exists in
gestiones,
this
pero
regard in the
sirva además
region.
para
Sometimes
aprender
tools can
qué
facilitate the
debería estar,
management, but
cuáles son las
we
cláusulas
also need to
mínimas,
understand
qué
what the minimum
deberíamos estar
required standards and
pensando. Estoy de
provisions
acuerdo con lo
should
que
be
dices, que
as part of what we are considering.
Este fue un primer paso y
It's
quizás,
clear that this is only a
vemos
first
luego la
step,
necesidad de
and
publicar
perhaps later
una
on,
versión
we may
específica, por
see the
ejemplo, para
need to
patrocinadores
publish
estatales,
specific
para
versions of the document
patrocinadores,
for
pero
state
bueno,
sponsors or different sponsors.
esperamos que las aclaraciones al margen que
And we
hemos
hope that
incluido
the
en la publicación
clarifications in the
sirvan
footnotes
entre
that we've
tanto para hacer
included in the
todos los
publication
ajustes
can be
necesarios
useful for
según sus
anyone
niveles
using the instrument
específicos.
to make the necessary
Es un
adjustments
gran gusto ahora
required by their
presentar a
own
Carlos
leadership.
Burger, que
Now it's
estoy
a real
segura,
pleasure for
Álvaro
me
Silva,
to
vendrías un
introduce
poco más
Carlos
sobre el tema
Berger,
que puso
who
Carlos
will
Álvarez a discusión, que
elaborate a
es
little bit on what was
relacionado a
mentioned
la
by
póliza de
Carlos Alvarez
seguros.
when he
Y
talked
bueno,
about insurance
Carlos
policies.
Burger, a quien conocen
Carlos
ustedes de otras
Berger,
presentaciones
whom you all know,
previas, es
based
parte
on
del
his
equipo
previous
nuclear que ha
presentations,
trabajado en
he's part
esto.
of
Él
the
es
main team
abogado,
that has worked on
doctorado
this.
en
He's an
ciencias
attorney
jurídicas y
with
sociales
PhD
y
in political
coordina el
science.
Comité de Ética
He
Central
also
del Ministerio
coordinates
de
the
Salud de la
Central
provincia de
Ethics Committee
Buenos
in the
Aires y además se
Ministry of
desempeña
Health in
como
Buenos Aires.
docente
And
de
he's also a
bioética en la
professor
Universidad de
of
Buenos Aires y en la
bioethics in
Universidad de La
the
Plata.
Buenos Aires University
Carlos,
and
adelante y muchísimas gracias
Universidad de
por
La
estar
Plata.
con nosotros el día de
Carlos,
hoy.
thank you very much for joining us today.
No, por favor, Carla, muchas gracias a
Please,
todos
Carla,
porque
thank you very much.
realmente
Thanks to
finalmente la
everyone because
criatura ha nacido
at the end
después
of
de
the
tanto
day,
tiempo
the
y
baby has
tanto
been
que hemos
born after
debatido
such a
y
long
efectivamente,
time
como
and
lo has
all the debates
explicado,
and all the
el
discussions
aporte
as
de todos
you've
los
explained and
expertos, diversos
after all
países,
of the
ha sido muy
contributions and
valioso.
insight by the experts from the
Quizá
various
siendo
countries,
el último
we've
orador
come to a
en
very
esta
valuable
breve
situation.
charla, voy a proponerme defender lo
Instead
que
of
hicimos
giving a
y
presentation,
también
I'd like to just elaborate a
¿me
little
escuchan
bit
acá?
on what we did.
Perdón, ahí está. Lo que decía entonces
And
es, voy a proponerme defender
what I was saying
algunas
is that
fortalezas del
I'd like
modelo
to
que se
just
ha
highlight some of
implementado
the
o que
strengths
se
of the
implementa a
model
través
contract
de
that has
esta
been
herramienta
implemented
BOPS. El primer
through this
desafío que
PAHO
tuvimos que encarar
tool.
cuando empezamos
The first
a
challenges that we
conversar
faced when
sobre
we
la
started the
posibilidad de resolver
conversation
fue
on
superar
the
las
possibility
diferencias
of doing this
nacionales. Bien,
was the
marcos jurídicos
international aspects
diferentes,
and
teníamos que
international
buscar
borders,
algo que los
different
nucleara.
legal frameworks.
Bien,
We needed
y
something that
justamente lo que
could
nucleó
be
esta diferencia
in
de
compliance
posibles
with
diferencias
everything. And
jurídicas
what we
ha
found in
sido una
compliance
práctica
in
clínica.
this
Bien, algo
legal
que, como
discussion
decía Sara,
that
no
was common
pretende reproducir
were
el
clinical
contrato, no
practices.
pretende copiarlo,
Now, we're
pero
not
es
trying
cierto
to
que cuando
copy
uno
the
revisa
contract,
toda la
but it is
normativa de
true that
buenas
when you
prácticas
look at all of the
clínicas,
best
hay tres
clinical
aspectos en los
practice
cuales todos
standards,
estamos de
there are three
acuerdo.
aspects in which
Uno,
we all agree.
obviamente, tiene que ver con el
First,
tema del financiamiento.
we
Ese
have
es
the
el
issue of
aspecto.
financing,
Financiamiento a
clearly,
cargo de quién
the
promociona,
financing
promueve,
managed by
patrocina
whom
bien
that promotes
del proyecto.
or that is
El
driven by the
otro
sponsor of the
aspecto tiene
project.
que ver con
The other
cuestiones,
topic
diríamos, más
has to do
técnicas del
with more
quehacer de una
technical
investigación, de
aspects
los cuales todos estamos
involved
de
in
acuerdo internacionalmente que se
research
deberían
trial.
poner a práctica
And
de acuerdo con
clearly,
lo
we
que
have to
se ha
use
hecho.
the
Y el tercer
best
punto es la
practices
responsabilidad,
that are
un
in
tema
place
que
in
ha
that regard.
surgido durante
Then the issue of
este
responsibility,
encuentro,
which is something
donde
that came
también
up
estamos de
during this
acuerdo, al
meeting, and
menos
we
en
all
la misma
have
buena
common
práctica
agreement
clínica, que existe la
that
responsabilidad del
as
patrocinante por
regards the good
aquellos
clinical
tratamientos
practices,
vinculados a
the
lesiones, daños
sponsor,
provenientes del
when
dolor o
dealing with different
procedimientos de COVID.
treatments and
Este,
different
diríamos, paso
studies related
inicial
to medications or what
fue
have you,
lo más
all
importante
need
para
to be
superar las
standardized.
diferencias
This was a
internacionales,
very
porque
important
nunca
step for us to be
estaremos
able
frente a un
to
sistema
broach the
jurídico de
subject of
tipo más
international issues.
convencional o libre
Now, when we
acuerdo entre las
look at
partes,
this
como
from
un
a
sistema
more
migratorio
conventional
o un
legal
sistema de
standpoint,
responsabilidad
or when
civil
we think
más
about a
obligatorio
liability
en instancias
system that is more
diferentes. Pasa
binding,
con los
as we
países,
see
en el caso de
in several
Argentina,
countries,
que
such as
heredan
Argentina,
del
which inherited the topic of liability from the Napoleonic legal system. Now, if we can't negotiate this, we can at least negotiate both legal frameworks from the clinical practicist standpoint. And this also stems from the fact that there are local laws that have jurisdiction over liability issues at the local level. And based on good practices, even though we do heed the liability issues, you can always maintain the proper compliance on the part of the sponsor. Now, once we found this common space in which we agree in the region, we were able to then extrapolate from that and address other issues. Now we have a tool that has established a legal obligation. Some of the aspects that relate to the logistics, the development of the research, and some ethical considerations. And this is the inclusion of predetermined obligations within the contract body related to the exercise of research. And this is a legal framework, which is not of minimal importance. So we have certain clinics that have to adhere to certain legal standards, such as informed consent and other matters. Then we would have to include this in a legal contract. Now, we cannot set aside this requirement. Now, we also have IP, intellectual property. We've talked about publication of reports, intellectual property, and the burden that this represents from the legal standpoint. We also have that anything referring to publications, transparency, the confidence in the research system, and the public review of the results by the public sector, given that they are the main funding entity for many of these projects. And lastly, the financing issues that, as we mentioned today, has a great deal of diversity or variety in the region today. So we need to subject what we do to constant review and revision, and this has to be addressed in the body of the contract. Now, clearly, the sponsor has to have some obligations and some exemptions, especially in certain issues related to liability. I'd like to address three main points that Carlos had already mentioned and some of the other colleagues mentioned. What do we mean by the issue of responsibility of liability? So we have here some clauses, provisions that involve research centers and ethics committees. And in many countries, the ethics committee needs to review the contract. And the researchers also have to review it. When we talk about liability and responsibility, we're talking about a very sensitive issue. It's a triad of obligations. One has to do with the responsibility over the costs, direct responsibility. What do I mean by this? More than insisting on the presence of insurance and other clauses related to insurance, it is true that the sponsor will always hold the responsibility and liability. That's why, as part of these clauses or provisions, there needs to be a specific clause that addresses reimbursement for any and all medical treatment deemed necessary for any of the participants that subjected themselves to the pharmaceutical trial. Now, if there's any issue related to liability for the victims of the study or something like that, then this needs to be addressed in the contract, and it needs to address any reimbursement that could be in place for the institution as well. The second component of this triad is the indemnity that all parties concede mutually to each other, especially from the criminal aspect for the exercise of this project. And many times you have damages involved in one of these treatments. And we also see that the adequate treatment of data in the proper exercise of a research, there may be a third party that retains the right to make any claims. And in many cases, there needs to be immunity for certain legal processes, especially when the research may have, or the researcher or any researcher may have veered from the protocol. Now, there is indemnity and immunity in certain issues, but in other cases, what we are saying is that any proper exercise of research within the limits of the protocol, if there's any third party that believes that they have a right to a claim, they need to be able to submit their claim in a timely way. The third topic related to responsibility liability, which is related to what Carlos was mentioning, involves insurance. As you all know, there are certain standards and certain schedules for insurance, and they have certain purview in the clinical trials arena. And in some cases, there's 100% coverage, but there's a difference with regard to possible professional liability insurance policies due to malpractice by physicians or researchers or poor research practices. Now, as you all know, this is not a uniform condition in all countries. Some countries require these clauses where they specifically refer to the proper insurance in place. Now, in some contracts, they also required a professional liability policy. So this also relates to the regulatory framework, and it needs to involve an agreement between all the parties. And in almost any and all business contract, given that we're talking in clinical trials or of clinical trials, we see that the contract has a great deal more weight. Therefore, the requirement for professional liability insurance is part of the customary practices of these clinical trials managers and sponsors. Now, something that's very interesting for us here in the debate is what could be the difference that could exist between malpractice and a research practice. And we saw something recently with a colleague, female colleague in Argentina, who I was discussing this within the academia area. Are there really that many differences? For example, any malpractice that was observed in a specific context that led to some kind of harmful result, or when the researcher, him or herself, is responsible for the design and by extension for the harm, there may be a different application. But when we talk about clinical trials, there's no difference in its substance from malpractice, other than the existence of the protocol. We talk about the medication administration, the procedural issues, anything related to clinical trials. The practice of this does not have a great deal of difference with other clinical practices. And this is something that we are still gathering data from. So it'd be interesting for us to debate this, but nevertheless, despite this, what we see as a requirement in almost all contracts is this professional liability insurance policy, and this does not exclude coverage based on the fact that it's a medical exercise that's part of a clinical trial. But as we've discussed this in group, there is a great deal of emphasis placed on insurance policies, that it's a regulatory requirement, it's a constant presence for regulators and clinical practitioners, but it's basically the primary responsibility of the sponsor. The main responsible party is the sponsor. And so they're acting as a guarantor, as the main responsible party for this coverage. And so we need the presence of the sponsor responsibility. So it's very important for us to properly define who the sponsor is from a legal standpoint, because there could be some potential economic solvency or liability involved. Another thing that I'd like to mention is something mentioned by Francisca. She talked about efficiency, efficient processes to be able to achieve the specific purpose, and efficiency over time. She talked about the framework agreement, and I agree with Francisca that one way to streamline the negotiation process would be to define this, to come up with some framework agreements based on provisions that we can all agree. We can discuss these once, and then the negotiation process in and of itself would then just deal with some details. And this will accelerate, to a large extent, the negotiation of contracts. And we won't have to be subjected to these long-term negotiations. And in many cases, we can handle this outside of a research context. When we're talking about a sponsoring laboratory for a research center, we discuss responsibilities and liability and mutual agreements. We can set up a framework agreement, and then over time, during the undertaking of the clinical trial, we would only just address and manage the specific issues that were discussed in advance. Another thing that I thought was important that was mentioned by Carlos relates to ethics. And we do have some differences in the region with regard to ethics committees and what purview they may have over these types of instruments. I think this tool could be a very agile and very useful instrument for these ethics committees who, in many instances, have to review contracts as a requirement for their regulatory framework in their countries, because this will lead to the standardization of ethical criteria. This will lead to the regional standardization of ethics committees. And in such a subject, in such a specific and sensitive subject, we may over time be able to standardize all of this over time. That's all I had. Thank you very much. Thank you for the work, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Carlos. Before you sign off, I'd like to ask Adriel and Sara to join us briefly in the session. I think that the subject is extremely complex. It involves reading all the fine print and the details contained in the tool. But I'd like to briefly address two questions that were posed. And then I'd like to see if the other panelists can maybe take a minute to share some parting remarks with our audience, having heard all of the various interactions and insights. One question is whether clinical trials with nutritional or natural elements also require a contract, or perhaps a broader version of this question is, for what types of research is a contract necessary? For all clinical trials or only for some? That's the question, two versions of it. The second question is, do you know whether or not there exists a regional model or a budget for potential study of the pathology under review that could be used to supplement the model contract? So let me just yield the floor to you. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and answer these questions. Whoever wishes the floor, please let us know. Go ahead, Carlos. Well, I thought that the question was brilliant because this is something that I've been discussing for some time, and we discussed it recently in a meeting, in a conference here in Argentina. It seems as if we operate under the fantasy in which contracts are only required when the regulatory space requires it, or where there's a significant risk involved, or when we're talking about a risky pharmaceutical product or procedure. And that's not the case. It could be a research project with nutritional elements natural elements. It could be a data management protocol, an observational study. So what do we need to be able to require the signing of a contract? For me, there needs to be an understanding of any contrasting interests. And so you need an instrument to ascertain what those elements are and negotiate them. So if we have something related to intellectual property and a number of ramifications that stem from it, I need to have a contract for that to protect my interests. And we've seen this many times in some studies that came out of public bids or RFPs at the national level, whereby many intellectual property rights were placed at risk, and due to a lack of demand and signing an agreement, we saw a lot of cases of intellectual property violation rights. So this led to a lot of issues. So when we talk about an issue where there may be contrasting interest, there's certain sponsorship requirements, etc., then I say contracts need to be mandatory, regardless of whether it's a simple situation or a complex one. Clinical trial or a literature review or any other kind of clinical research trial. But when we see at the outset contrasting interests or conflicts of interest among the stakeholders for any project, then you necessarily need to put in place a contract that protects everybody's rights. And it also includes certain obligations and requirements, not the least of which would be IP rights. I think this may be a corporate defense of our profession, but to remove all doubt, we need to have clear-cut rules and requirements between the parties. So whenever you ask if there are things that could perhaps lead to not having to use a contract, I think the best policy is to put everything in writing and ensure that all of the parties understand and are on the same page with regard to their obligations and responsibilities. The other question that relates to the budget model, I vaguely recall that we addressed this as part of the framework for this work, and we thought about a draft template, but it was very difficult for us to come up with a proposal for a draft budget template that would work, because there's a great deal of variety in the studies, and it was very complex to try to incorporate the complexity of the design, the locations, the procedures. There are as many budgets as there are project designs for clinical research. Some of them have general objectives, others more specific, work-related objectives. It's not always going to be the same thing. Not everybody's going to be paid in the same way. So there's a multiplicity of scenarios that made it very difficult for us to come up with a template for a budget. So we do have to do some work related to budgets, but we didn't come up with a draft budget proposal for certain cases. I just wanted to add 2 points to this related to the counter offer. You can see the content model that addresses standards and practices and what needs to be paid by the sponsor and certain considerations that need to be addressed. That's one. And I wanted to emphasize that this is a model contract that is geared towards clinical trials that use good clinical practices. And this also addresses the intervention by the regulatory authorities in the country. But the model can be used for other research contracts. Now, remember, when you look at the model contract, you're going to see a link that says this will take you to a Word document where you can unload free of charge the version of the contract so that you can use it, adapt it, learn a little bit more, see what works, what doesn't work, and in that way, facilitate everybody's contractual life in that way. Thank you.
Gracias, colegas.
Thank you very much, colleagues. We just have a few minutes left, but I'd like to invite Fernando, Francisca, and Carlos, just in case they have any last words, any parting comments. You don't have to. I see Carlos has his camera open. Go ahead. 30 seconds, Carlos.
Bueno, yo creo que
Well,
felicitaciones a todo el equipo
I'd like to
que estuvo
congratulate the
trabajando en
team
esta
members
propuesta
who
llevarla
worked on
a buen
this
término
proposal
y creo
and
que
came up with this
este
instrument.
documento le
I
da
think this
estatus a este
document
componente
will give
fundamental de la
a
investigación
certain
clínica. Algunas
status
veces lo
to
olvidamos
this
y ese olvido
rather neglected
cuesta,
component of any
demanda
clinical
tiempo,
trial. It's
trabajo y
something that
algunas veces
we've
recursos
really
en ensayos no
struggled
se
with
llevan a cabo.
for many, many years, and now I think we can see some light at the end of the tunnel with regard to that process. Thank you. Francisca. Well, I also wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity. I want to thank the team members for engaging in this work. I think this represents the beginning for us to be able to expand participation in clinical trials at the regional level, not just from the standpoint of patients, but it also offers the possibility of more public institutions to participate in these clinical trials. There's more projects that could be developed in clinical trials as a result. And in Chile, you can always count on us to support any implementation process that you may need help with. And so thank you very much and congratulations.
Gracias, Fernando.
Fernando?
Bueno, agradecer por la
I
invitación,
also
por
wanted
estar
to
acá.
thank the
Quiero
organizers
decir
of
que
today's
nuestros
event for the
colegas han
invitation.
aportado excelentes perspectivas sobre
I
la
think that all of the
implementación
colleagues
y la
have
importancia
shared
de
some
la
excellent
herramienta,
insights on the importance of the
que
tool.
vejo como próximos pasos para
As
todos nosotros
next steps for all of
debemos
us, I think
difundir el modelo de
we should
contrato en nuestros
include
países, en toda la región.
disseminating this model
Y
contract in
acompanhar
all the
de
countries for
perto,
their review. And we also
cerca
need to continue
los
supporting very
comentários
closely
que venham a surgir, para
any
que possamos
comments or
pensar
insights that
em
may
futuros,
result
por ejemplo,
after this review by all our colleagues all over the region. Any potential improvement
por favor,
ideas that
contem
we
comigo,
could
com la Abracro, para
garner
a
for the
implementação
instrument.
do modelo de herramienta
And
aqui em
you
Brasil.
could always count on my
Gracias.
support to
Muchas
help you
gracias,
continue to
colegas.
improve this
Quiero
model contract for the
cerrar la
region. Thank you.
sesión
Very
agradeciendo a
well.
nuestros
Thank you very much,
traductores
colleagues. I'd
por
like
este
to
tipo de
thank our
apoyo que hace
colleagues
no solamente que esta
as well
sesión
as our
sea posible,
interpreters and
sino
the
que sea
team members
posible
that
luego
made today's
compartirles la
webinar
grabación a todos.
possible and who will also
Y
share
además
the
quiero
recording
agradecer
of the
muy
webinar today
encarecidamente a
with
todas las
everyone. I
personas que
also
han
wanted to
contribuido
thank
a lo largo del
all of the
proceso,
people who have
dando
contributed
comentarios
enormously throughout the
generales,
process
específicos,
with their
diciendo que nos
insights,
olvidamos de algo,
comments,
porque la
feedback,
riqueza de este
specific
trabajo
issues.
se debe a la
The
contribución de
richness
todos
of this
ustedes
effort was
y una palabra
primarily due
especial de
to
agradecimiento
contributions
para
from all of you. And I'd
el
like to
equipo
thank my
técnico
own team,
de
technical
trabajo que
team
montamos para esto.
at PAHO,
Este es
who
solo el
worked so
inicio
hard to
y
put this
estaremos
together.
enviando la
I do want to
grabación de esta
say that
sesión
this is only the
siempre. Por
beginning,
supuesto,
and you will
también
all be
el enlace
sent
para la
a
comunicación en
link to the
español
recording of today's
tanto en inglés y
session.
portugués también.
And as I stated,
Hasta
the
luego,
model
colegas, que tengan
contract
una
will be
excelente tarde.
available in English and Portuguese very soon. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.